All right. Welcome to episode 64 of this podcast. 63. For those of you who are on YouTube, you get to see this first. So basically, next week you'll hear a guest on the podcast, Phil Wesley, who commented on. Who, of course, commented on Gamergate and what have you, from his perspective, covering video games for a very long time. So, in this episode, which reminds me of the N64 for whatever reason, but we haven't talked about this company in a while, and they've taken quite a beating as of late, haven't they?
Well, I think for most of their history, they've taken a real big beating, especially by Intel.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about the Underdog Chipmaker, AMD, Advanced Micro Devices. I've had both systems from Intel, AMD. I've also had a system at one point with a VIA processor in it too, which is I eventually got rid of it or gave it away to somebody, which if memory serves, it wound up in a dumpster at some point. So I'm like, I should have kept it, but honestly, VIA's processors were pretty underwhelming, so to say the least. But so AMD's like the number 2 chip maker, and without AMD, Intel's prices for their products would probably be even higher than they are now. So competition's a good thing, right?
Especially in the processor market. That's what Intel's biggest share of what they make is from the processors. And to kind of comment on the fact that if we didn't have competition, Intel's prices would be ridiculous. Personally, I think they're bad enough as it is, but I'll give you an example. One of their current Core i7 processors, like basically almost high-end desktop processor, is I think around $300. If you want to get the highest-end desktop processor, even from probably 5-6 years ago, as long as I've been following this, it's been at least $1,000. And from about that time, they've been 6 cores. So it's pretty ridiculous, and it would be even higher than that if AMD wasn't in the game. Yeah, Core i7 4770K, which is currently I think the highest you can get, is $334.
So yeah, they've always had to compete with Intel. From what I understand, word of mouth has been their biggest asset. Hey, this is a lot cheaper than Intel and pretty comparable. And they started out from reverse engineering their stuff and everything else, and it was ultimately Intel not being able to trademark numbers. They couldn't trademark x86, they couldn't trademark 486, 586, etc. So they started going with Pentium, right? Because you can trademark a word, you can't trademark a series of numbers, as it was ruled in the courts. So that's where all that stuff came from, and AMD followed suit with Athlon, Duron, Sempron, etc. And then they had their Fusion, Bobcat, Bulldozer, Vishra, Hondo, and they're even getting into the ARM architecture. Uh, so here's where they're at right now. Last I read, their stock was $2.70 a share. They have a new CEO, Lisa Su, and of course because of Wayland issues with GNOME 3, their Catalyst driver will not work in GNOME 3 for whatever reason. It's not just a Fedora issue; it is also a Debian issue as well, because it's a GNOME 3 problem, and since Catalyst mainly works with, say, x.org as opposed to Wayland, the proposed fix for it is you have to recompile GNOME 3 without the Wayland code in it, which most people are not going to be willing to do anyhow. So, and open drivers are not always an option for some people who want specialized features on their portables. So, and you've had problems with GNOME 3 yourself, I take it.
I've had some issues with GNOME 3 in the past. Not on the AMD device that I have. The desktop I'm currently using to speak with you guys is completely AMD because I'm an AMD fan. I'm a fan of the Underdog. Throw punches if you want to. I don't care. But yeah, I'm a fan of AMD. I don't think I've ever ran GNOME 3 on this machine. Maybe in virtual machines, but that shouldn't be an issue. I know on the Linux side of my desktop, which I'm not currently on, I think the last episode, I don't remember. But I know on that side, I do have issues with the driver occasionally, and it's extremely difficult to update the driver. Because in my case, I usually have to force an update. Either
right.
low level in the kernel or something that I always have. And every time I upgrade the desktop, I have another problem that I have to fix. It's usually a couple days time to figure it out. But in terms of GNOME 3, I don't think I've had any issues.
Because I've Fedora, there's nobody packaging Catalyst anymore. Version 21, same problem, and my hard drive everything's freezing up. Oh crap. Well, that worried me for a second.
Well, I'm okay. You're good now. I get video feed. I'm still getting audio feed, just no video feed.
And the funny part is, I can see you just fine. So. Oh, Google, come on.
I've got multiple hard drives in the machine I'm using. My boot drive is a solid state drive, and the other is a 1 terabyte hard drive. So I've got a backup just in case if the solid state fails. But this is also my gaming desktop for those of you that know me.
Oh yeah. So continuing on before the whole thing goes kerplunk. Forbes has kind of had a forecast for returning to profitability, and I need to take a look at this again. And while that's loading,
Look at it up on my machine.
While that's loading, oh, I don't care about your welcome message. Go away.
Basically, what the article covers, the synopsis of it, is it's focusing on their earnings from Q3 of this year, of 2014, and AMD should focus on commercial PCs, which is something they have been focusing on for the last year and a half, I think, with a focus on the server market, developing ARM processors for the server market. I've not had any experience with a server machine. I'd like one sometime in the future. That would be awesome. But right
Right.
now, money is a problem for that, and you can't hardly get old server products for free. So
Oh yeah. Um, and basically, it's being said they believe in their long-term growth potential. It's saying its revenues increased 26% and non-GAAP EPS improved by 26 cents in the first half of the year, same compared to the same period previous year. And they reprofiled debts at lower rates, which will reduce its expense with no significant debt coming due until 2019. So basically, you know, you said focusing on the commercial PCs and things like that. And they still have a larger presence in there, but they're also in other markets as well. And they mentioned the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, Nintendo's Wii U. It also meant it's also their chips also power.
I think that was probably the best move that AMD's made in a long time. I'm not sure exactly how they pulled that off, but they basically have their hand in every next-gen console that can come out, that's come out in the last 2 years, and they're probably going to stay popular for at least 5 to 10 years. I don't see them going out for a while, so AMD's locked in at least that amount of income, revenue, just from the game consoles. And I know the PS4 sold record amounts, much more than the Xbox One did. So, and that's the one that they put a little more focus into anyway.
And in all honesty, we were talking about, you know, next gen consoles several episodes back. We talked about both Sony and Microsoft and how AMD was going to be a big winner in all of these, and it appears they are at this point. So yeah, they're having some issues, and in the free and open source realm, their proprietary drivers may be having issues with GNOME 3 because they're not staying kind of up to date with that, but they've got other things going for them. They're trying to get into the server markets. They've got ARM licenses. Their graphics division, which we mentioned earlier, was they're still dominant with NVIDIA over Intel, even with Intel's Iris Pro graphics, which surprisingly I haven't seen in very many systems. The only system that I've seen it in, or that I know of that it's in, is one of System 76's notebooks that they sell.
Intel's Iris Pro graphics, one of the reasons why it's one of the best integrated graphics setups out there is because Intel did a weird move, honestly, with how the processor handles the graphics. For those of you that don't know, integrated graphics in the past used to be on the main board of your system. It was basically the north bridge of your motherboard. Both AMD and Intel have moved a lot of the features of the north bridge directly onto the processor, and one of those features is the integrated graphics. And what Intel did to make the Iris Pro graphics what they are is it basically has 128, well, I mean, I think this varies, but it has embedded RAM on the processor itself. I know for one example, I think for the Iris Pro specifically, it has 128 megabytes of RAM directly on the chip, specifically for graphics processing, nothing else. And when you develop a processor like that, that takes a lot of resources, and it's super expensive, especially if you want that like you have level 2 and level 3 caches, which are some of the fastest storage systems next to a register, which is in the processor. I won't get into the details for that.
Right.
But for them to do that, it's probably highly cost effective, but it was also pretty expensive to make. So it's one of the most interesting moves I've seen so far.
Well, and I do partially take back what I said. It's in an open source OEM system or an Ubuntu OEM system and Apple computers. That's it. That's what I've seen so far, and
it's not widely popular. I know that for sure. So I was going to agree with you on that, because as far as I can tell, I know System 76 uses some of their machines that they've just come out with. They use the Iris Pro graphics, and then the only other thing I can think of is some MacBook Pros. It's not even on the MacBook Air, I don't think.
And I do so now that I look, there are some boutique ones that are doing it too. It's just one would think that it would actually have, you know, more than that, but or it would be more advertised, but it's not, which is kind of weird.
I'm assuming probably because the tray price of the processor is pretty high for a mobile processor for that sort of technology.
Yeah, and look, even looking at a Zotac Z-Box mini PC, it costs about $500. So, and that's just with an Intel Core i5. So, but AMD's so basic for more. AMD still has a better mindshare on graphics than Intel, even though their graphics has been kind of steadily going up bit by bit. It's still outclassed by both NVIDIA and AMD, and AMD actually did the whole accelerated processing unit thing as well. An old netbook I had, had one of those processors in it, to where it had the yeah. It was like the C70 or the Aspire 1 722 or something like that, and it had the C60 APU, or yeah, I believe it was C60, and it had like the Radeon graphics built in and everything else. But so they have their ARM licenses, their graphics division, and you spotted their Zen architecture that they've been working on as well.
Yeah, it's just like I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of AMD. The system I'm on right now, it's got both AMD graphics and an AMD processor. Thomas, you mentioned this earlier. One of the architectures that they came out with in, I believe it was 2011. I think they might have been still developing it in 2010. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on this. It was the bulldozer architecture. It was a major change that they had went from the. Let me see, what was it? Oh, I cannot remember. It was in their Phenom 2s and Athlon 2s, the last generation of those from previous to the bulldozer architecture that they made. The biggest change is both of them were multi-core processors, which is basically in SMT, symmetric multi-threading, or SMP, sorry, symmetric multiprocessing. They changed from that to what they call CMT, which is like clustered multiprocessing. And on the processor, you have like a level 1, level 2, and level 3 cache. You generally will have multiple cores now, and inside a core you have specifically in an AMD processor, you have like an integer core and then a floating point unit. You have things like ALUs and all kinds of other stuff that do a lot of the other functions of a processor. But in the Bulldozer architecture, they changed it to where you have a module which contains what you would normally call a core or an integer core. And there's two of those in one module. But the two cores in the module share your level 2 and level 3 caches, or it shares the level 2 cache. All the cores share their level 3 cache. And they also share a floating point unit within each module. In the processor that I have on my desktop, it's an 8-core processor, 4 modules. So basically I have 4 floating point units and 8 integer units. So technically 8 cores, even though it's not real cores. It's the same thing like with Intel's hyper-threading technology. You have 6 core. You can have a quad core or 6-core processor with. If you have hyper-threading enabled, you have like virtually 12 to, or 8 to 12 like threads available, and it's a similar process. It gets a little complicated when you look low down in the system, but a top-level design is pretty simple. I completely forgot where I was going with that.
So basically, from looking at that article, Core is back with Zen. They're going with something that's more efficient because various publications from Maximum PC to others, kept benchmarking Bulldozer, and they, found out that, well, what they did was not quite good enough to go after Intel. It wasn't shabby, it wasn't horrible, it was not as efficient as it could have been.
Not as well done as the previous architectures, basically.
So, back to the drawing board, they went and got various people from various companies. One of them being Apple, they poached somebody from Apple and went and got, Lisa Su and what have you. And Sue is now the new CEO. She's unfortunately getting paid less than the last guy, Rory Reid, but yeah, I see their stock price, and it's sort of like toilet paper going on sale. You gotta stock up if you're an investor. I'm not a full-on investor, so that's why I'm not jumping into something like that. But they've got a lot of potential. It's just taking longer than people are anticipating. They're spreading themselves out and building a foundation because, let's face it, desktop computers, they're not going to go away, but it's not going to quite be the same either. So
it's not a growing market, and like the Forbes article pointed out, AMD is trying to latch on to a lot of those growing markets. Like right now, they've acquired these ARM licenses. This new Zen architecture that they're working on is going to be both based on x86 and ARM. So they're going to be able to target like personal computing, tablets, phones with ARM. They'll be able to. Well, there's tablets that are both x86 and ARM-based architectures. So I mean, it's kind of both half and half. But they'll be able to target a lot of growing markets like smartphone and tablet markets, which are still growing. They latched onto those new next-generation gaming consoles, which was a real big win for them, and that's going to be a growing market. People are going to continue to buy more and more of those things as PS3 and Xbox 360 games are going to quit, no longer be developed, and Nintendo moves from the Wii to the Wii U. Because you can still buy a Wii. It's now the Wii Mini, I think, or something like that, which was also based on AMD technology with ATI graphics, which AMD bought years ago. So it's interesting what's going to happen. I'm not sure exactly what will happen, but it'll be very interesting.
And right now it's like planting the seeds and waiting for it to grow, and Wall Street getting impatient. And I've always said to myself, if I ever become an investor, I would be looking sharply at AMD if their stock price is still very, very low. Throw some money in that and and wait for them to make a comeback, because and plus I like the idea that they were opening their specifications on their older graphics cards and graphics units, because frankly it makes sense. If you don't want to support older graphics cards anymore, why not let the people in free and open source software do it for you?
It's not a bad choice. Um, free and open source software has paved the way for a lot of things. You wouldn't have what we're using right now. We wouldn't have Google Hangouts. Google bases a lot of the stuff that they have. Google Drive, the entire Gmail system. If you've got a smartphone, if you've got an Android smartphone, that's entirely based on open source. It's Linux based. I mean, all kinds of stuff that Google does. You wouldn't have printer drivers without Apple supporting open source software.
Right.
Pretty much the only thing I can think of that really kind of has always fought against open source is Microsoft.
And
Sure
and
exactly why.
and and even now, because of their Azure platform, they're saying that they've changed their tune on the Linux kernel,
Starting to accept it.
because they're, from a business standpoint, it's got a significant market share in certain places that they're not going to be able to touch at this point, and they need streams of revenue somehow. So Logic would dictate supporting that as well. Where do you see AMD heading towards in the future?
I think, well, their target for this Zen architecture, I think this is going to be a good thing for them, especially with the flop of the Bulldozer and Piledriver architectures. Piledriver was based on Bulldozer. I personally have seen the bad and good side of the Bulldozer architecture. I like it. It's great for gaming. For the price, it was really good. But like if you're doing strictly number crunching, like if you're doing a lot of floating point stuff, it's going to suck because it's limited to 4 floating point units compared to 8 integer units. I'm talking specifically about the processor that I have. But going back to the original architecture base that they had before Bulldozer, using SMT instead of SMP instead of CMP, is going to be a good step. They're not going to lose any ground in the graphics division. I can tell you that right now, because the graphics that they have out now, the R9, 290, and 290X series, which is the highest end that you can get, has beat the crap out of NVIDIA lately. So even NVIDIA just put out their next generation 980 and 970 GTX graphics cards, which are supposed to pit right up against the R9 290 and R9 290X. Even they can't even come up close to where the 290 and 290X sits. I mean, it's always been neck and neck between NVIDIA and AMD when it comes to that high-end graphics. Mid-level, still about the same, and then not too many people focus on the low-range dedicated graphics. If you're going with integrated, AMD has such a large grasp on the integrated graphics market. NVIDIA has completely just abandoned it. I don't think NVIDIA makes any integrated graphics anymore. Like even their Tegra K1 boards that they put out recently, I think part of the graphics has moved to a dedicated chip, but it's half of it's integrated. I don't know. It's a weird architecture that they have. But other than that, I don't think they have any integrated graphics. The Tegra processors is probably about it.
And the last one that I have known of, but besides their Tegra chips, is their Ion.
I completely forgot about Ion. Sorry.
Well, no, it's and that's been like years ago, and now it's, and you can still find systems that have the Ion graphics in them, But Intel and NVIDIA kind of parted ways on that one. So, and you mentioned earlier that you saw something about the manufacturing company that Apple was using was they were putting pressure on them to kind of not let other companies use them to fabricate chips and such as well.
The one he's talking about is TSMC, I think it is. Yeah, TSMC, Terascale Micro, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. Sorry, that's a mouthful. I don't know why I had trouble saying it, but both Apple, NVIDIA, and AMD all used this company for their chip actual manufacturing process. And let me see if I can find an article on that. I remember when I was looking at the AMD Zen architecture that was coming out, I did see an article basically saying that Apple has been pressuring TSMC to not to reserve all of their manufacturing for Apple and limit how much NVIDIA and AMD can produce. And because of that, along with the Zen architecture that AMD is coming out with, they are moving from using TSMC to Samsung, of all people, to using Samsung's FinFET architecture, which is going to be based on a 14-nanometer process. Basically, the 14 nanometer or whatever number of nanometers, basically the die size on the processors, super tiny.
And there was a clip of headline that I spotted, time to sell your TSMC stock because of Apple pressuring them, I guess. I don't know. It's just... So it's... There we go. That page is loading. It mentioned in the summary that through the search results that yeah, this are come on. One of the first things I'll do if I get a windfall of money is get this energy efficient system to my right replaced with something that has a little bit more oomph and still is efficient on power, like an AMD system that has an APU in it. But it does mention Apple putting pressure on them. Let's see, because I'm trying to look at this because this was back in July, and it said that their stock dropped nearly 5% on a Thursday. Because they wooed Apple for 3 years, according to this article, to snatch its processor chip business away from their biggest rival, Samsung. And I'm trying to... I'm not finding... It said it in the summary, but not in the article itself. That's irritating.
I can't seem to find the article anyway. I don't even remember where I saw it.
Wall Street Journal is mentioning it, or competitive pressures loom over TSMC, but unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm click the link, but I'm afraid a paywall's going to pop up. And I'm looking at this now. And they're talking about packing more power into their chips. But because it's mentioning Intel entering the market for mobile devices as well, and um, their revenue rose because of their deal with Apple, but doesn't mention anything about pressure from Apple to limit manufacturing from other companies.
I honestly don't remember where I read that. I know for sure that AMD is moving away from using TSMC. Apparently, Apple used to use Samsung for their processors and is now going to TSMC for them to manufacture the chips.
There is a headline that says NVIDIA is deeply unhappy with TSMC. Tech Soda. This might be the one you were looking at.
What is it?
Tech Soda is the website in question.
Doesn't sound familiar, but I don't know. I probably looked at it.
Because the headline's asking, if people are waiting on 20 NM graphics cards from NVIDIA and AMD, and I guess it's saying don't.
That's probably due to the problems that TSMC is facing. Some of the problems that TSMC is facing, along with the interaction between Apple, Samsung, NVIDIA, and AMD. Currently, I'm not so sure about NVIDIA, but I know AMD, the manufacturing process that they use is a 28 nanometer process, and they've been trying to move to get smaller and smaller. But even their current generation cards have a 28 nanometer GPU, and I don't know about NVIDIA. I think theirs is also 28 nanometers, but I can look that up on their 980 and see what that is.
Basically, wafer price is hiking up, and in NVIDIA, let's say TSMC, 1 month after the Extreme Tech article was released in April 2012, an EE Times article reported that TSMC would only be offering one process at 20 nm. This was well down from their four processes offerings at 28 nm, 3 low power and 1 high performance. So it's TSMC was not able to deliver. So it's so it sounds like NVIDIA wasn't happy anyway, and Global Foundries was being used for some of AMD's stuff too. A Maximum PC has kind of a headline saying yield problems may drive Qualcomm NVIDIA away from TSMC. So it's And IT World's claiming Apple made a mistake by switching to TSMC for their iPhone, basically their iPhone 6.
I think that was a shot in the foot overall. Just the change in the iPhone in general. I know people for the longest time were wanting like a style of phone like the iPhone 6 Plus with the super big screen, like phablet design like everybody else wants. But I think Apple had a good stance when they had the original iPhone. They had changed the design slightly over the years, but the screen never got any larger than 4 inches.
Right.
Up until the iPhone, I think 5, they got it a little bit bigger, and then the 6 just, they came out with 2 iPhones, one completely different design than the other. So
basically, I'm looking at this paragraph at the moment from Daily Tech. When it comes to the move away from Samsung to TSMC, it's worth noting a couple of things. First, this is just one chip. Samsung very well may be filling some of Apple's A8 AP orders, splitting duty with TSMC. Also, according to the rumor mill, it was on the verge of leapfrogging TSMC to 14nm, raising the chances that it may be back in the driver's seat for the next generation iPhone, 6S or possibly 7. And basically saying, if accurate, this news could be a major shakeup to a variety of industries. For Android phone makers and the biggest SoC APU supplier for Android devices, Qualcomm, this could be a major disruption, as Apple has tied up the stock of the best, fastest, most power-efficient process at one of the world's largest fabs. Qualcomm's leaned on this company heavily, and they may try to explore production with Samsung or even Intel at this point. Intel getting into the ARM game as well. And they may be they may be forced to look elsewhere too. And from what we were looking at, it may have been due to the expense problem with the 20nm, but Apple tends to put a lot of pressure on companies they do business with as well, so this shouldn't be a surprise. So it seems more like a volume production issue on TSMC's part than anything else, but so it's kind of a mixed bag, but again, AMD was using them from some of their stuff, but they were also using Global Foundries, which they initially, I guess, owned before spinning it off and going, here you go, according to the Wikipedia article we looked at earlier.
I think they still use Global Foundries for most of their processors. When it comes to, I think, graphics and stuff like that, that's where they were using TSMC's process, their 28 nanometer process. Oh, I got a website making noise. I am reading an interesting article right now that's slightly related to the topic we're on.
Right.
We were mentioning graphics earlier. It looks like they're changing the RAM for the new high-end graphics by the time next year rolls around. If you're familiar with high-end graphics, or most graphics, even the PS4 and Xbox One, which have AMD custom boards in them, they currently have GDDR5 memory for the graphics memory. The new memory that's going to be coming out is called, what is it, HBM, High Bandwidth Memory, which GDDR5 has high bandwidth memory anyway, but this is a new design. Instead of having like what it's called, it's like stacked DRAM. So like you have multiple RAM chips stacked or RAM sections stacked on each other. Compared to the previous generation, the GDDR5, one rail or one chip is supposed to be able to produce up to 7 gigabits per second of data rate, but one chip of the stacked is able to produce like up to 1 gigabits per second. But you can have multiple stacked on top of each other. And it's comparing the absolute max bandwidth overall of the chip. The new HBM stacked DRAM is supposed to be able to put out up to 64 gigabytes per second, while current generation GDDR5 can only put out 28. And it also is on a lower voltage and a couple other things. It's just really interesting. I just stumbled across this.
And you're specifically talking about what they call 3D memory, right?
I believe so. It doesn't mention anything about that here. Yeah, 3D stacked memory. Yeah, it's similar to. I assume it's probably similar to something else that Samsung has done recently with their what is it, 850 Evo solid state drives. They changed the chip controller on it. It's got a NAND flash controller, but it's instead of it being just a single controller, just a single layer, it's also a 3D stacked design, just like this RAM is. They're moving to that in a lot of things, I assume, to save space, because Intel went with that, probably 2 years ago when they came out with Haswell graphics, the Haswell processor.
Right. Because what the 3D name, they leaked AMD slides reported by Game Debate. So I guess they have links to those so-called slides talking about just that, and there's comments below on that. So look. So which is their graphic stuff. This is the first of the month too that they talk about this. So this is going to be. So basically, they're going to make a comeback through the back door, not necessarily the front door, and will take everybody by surprise when they least expect it. Is what I'm gathering from all of this.
The entire industry is moving in a lot of different ways right now. It's extremely interesting to see what they're doing, how computer architecture is changing. Because I'm taking a class right now that is called computer architecture, which focuses on like chip design and stuff like that. So it's a lot of low-level stuff that I'll try to never explain in this podcast, because I'm pretty sure it's going to go. Sometimes it goes over my head. So. But I know the entire industry is changing a lot, and it's part of it's to keep up with what's called Moore's law, which it's not a like set in stone kind of thing, but like what it is basically how computing power and everything else is going up in a linear fashion. To keep that up, they're slow. Originally they were just changing the process on the microprocessor, how it's made and stuff like that, still being single core, just ramping up clock speed and clock rate and stuff like that. And when they did that they realized that all that does is that'll cause more problems in the long run, because if you have a higher clock rate, and like say you have a specific thing supposed to happen, like you're doing just like a multiplication operation, and it takes your clock cycle time, which is the time that it takes to complete one cycle, or 1 hertz, which is the frequency at which something operates in a processor. As you ramp up your clock speed without focusing on anything else, that clock cycle time increases. So it takes a lot longer to do just a normal task. So that was what the problem was with the Pentium 4 when Intel decided, let's just ramp up the clock speed. That's why AMD kicked their butt that year with the Athlon 64 processor.
Because the clock speed doesn't tell the full story. That's also why for a long time the RISC processors that Apple used in their Macintosh products chug it. Just saw you chugging a beverage there. But that also explains why Apple's RISC, the processors from Motorola, and then the PowerPC architecture actually did better for a time against Intel's x86 is because at the time clock speed didn't tell the full story. It was the way it had a little bit more finesse until Intel decided to do a few extra things, and then bam.
They basically tripped over themselves. They didn't necessarily pay attention to their manufacturing processes. A couple of things here and there and stuff like that. I mean, it's a bigger story. You can get into it. There's plenty of details and stuff on documents and articles out there that talk about it. It was a problem that Intel they're still kind of recovering from it. I mean, you don't see it, they won't see it, but they're still. It's basically still we're still recovering up until a couple years ago, and now with their new processors that. It seems like they don't have anything to fear, so they've not been focusing on it again. So hopefully, this is AMD's chance to shoot them again.
and honestly, in order for the computing industry to move forward, there needs to be an AMD. There needs to be competition because we have the ARM architecture, but even now, there's still limits to the ARM architecture, and that's pure raw power in terms of processing. They haven't quite. They're still transitioning to 64-bit in that regards, even now, whereas the x86 has already been in 64-bit territory for years, or at least capable of it. Even though 32-bit's still prevalent, but it's kind of moving slowly but surely towards 64. That's why you buy most of your computers from, say, a big box retailer, even with like Windows 8 on it. You'll discover that it's a 64-bit edition of the OS itself, as opposed to 32-bit, even if it doesn't have 4 gigs of RAM in it, because the processors are geared more towards 64-bit processing. It'll still run your 32-bit apps, but that transition I noticed is kind of slowly but surely happening along the way.
Well, the transition in the ARM architecture to go from 32 to 64-bit, it was a real strong move over the last probably year and a half, 2 years or so, and now you're starting to see some phones come out with that are 64-bit capable.
Right.
There's not really any benefit to it right now. However, moving to that process where they're 64-bit capable is going to future-proof these devices, future-proof their process of making those chips to be able to support 64-bit in the future. Even now, like right now, you can buy the new Nexus devices that just came out, the Nexus 6, the new Nexus phone. It's 64-bit capable. A lot of Qualcomm, I think mine is even 64-bit capable. I don't know. I'd have to look it up.
I'd have to find out on my Note 3 if it's 64-bit capable or not. Probably not, but and that's why I'm assuming that's why AMD's making the moves they are now, because the door's going to start closing very quickly, and they've got the ARM licenses, and Intel's entered the ARM market as well, because even they're recognizing, hey, this is where it's at with power efficiency compared to powerful processing for mobile devices. So we'll see what happens. How long do you think it would take for AMD to kind of start making like a comeback? Because their stock price kind of starting to go back up a little bit, but how long will that last?
I'm not sure. It's going to be really hard to tell. I personally think like I mentioned earlier, I think that the step forward with this new architecture for their x86 architecture is going to be a good foundation for them to make even more steps forward. The problem is whether or not they're going to take those steps to increase their profitability and everything else. But with them branching out, and they have a really strong presence in the ARM market now. And they're going to be making this Zen architecture is going to be not just x86. It's going to be both x86 and ARM. I read somewhere that they're going to be designing a motherboard that's capable of switching between these two different CPUs. So basically, you could have like your ARM processor and your x86 processor, which is this Zen architecture, and pop it into the same board, whichever one you feel like. Now, will your operating system support that? Probably not. That's another different discussion for another day. But it's very interesting, and it's probably another step that AMD should take, and it's gonna enable a lot of possibilities and tap into their potential that they have. And if they just stick to what they're doing, I think they're going to be okay. They're going to be slowly progressing forward, but it's not going to be something that happens overnight or something that happens quickly or anything like that, because Intel has such a large presence and such a strong grasp of the market that they just can't bull rush and head in. They're going to have to be smart about their decisions and everything else.
And so they're...
Go ahead.
So it's a slow but sure kind of thing. Honestly, I'm going to go ahead and say it. I don't think that, like I said, I don't think the consumer PC market's going to die. At some point, something's going to come along that's going to be the next killer thing that's going to justify people having systems with 8 gigs of RAM or more. And that it's going to be something that anybody can do, and it's going to be hot and new and whatever. It just hasn't come along yet. Not even with casual gaming or anything like that.
In terms of casual gaming, I know there's a lot of games available for the tablet that I have, the Dell Venue. I've talked about it before. I've done a lot of work with it. I used it as basically my desktop, laptop replacement in class, and found out that was not a good idea. But it's 64-bit capable, but it's actually a 32-bit operating system because of the fact that it has 2 gigs of RAM in it. It has a 32-bit. Right. It even has a 32-bit BIOS, which is not very common anymore. A lot of UEFI BIOS setups on like desktop motherboards, laptop motherboards are 64-bit capable.
Right.
This one is 32-bit. It was a weird setup, and that's why I've been trying to see if I could just run Linux natively on that tablet. But to do that, I've got to jump over that hurdle of the 32-bit UEFI, which currently any Linux operating system, if you have a UEFI BIOS, you have to download the 64-bit version, but it won't work with the 32-bit BIOS.
Oh, so it's a accidental lockout or something like that, or a lock-in.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
You're not able to turn UEFI off on that system?
No, it's built in. The BIOS is UEFI only. There's no legacy BIOS support in this machine. So that's what the problem is. And it's also got secure root, but as long as you turn secure root off, you're fine. You can.
Okay, that's what I was.
People who have successfully ran Ubuntu, but to get it installed and everything else, it's going to be a massive hurdle. I know people are really trying, really pushing for it, especially, and I'd really love to do it if Ubuntu Touch comes out in an x86 form. That'd be awesome, but only time will tell.
So what was the first AMD product you've owned?
The first AMD product, probably the scratch that. My parents got a PC. I think I was in 8th grade when we first got it. It had an AMD Athlon. I think it was an Athlon 64. I can't remember exactly. It's in my closet. That's around the time that I still had the Intel Pentium MMX in my room. but it had an Athlon 64 and an ATI Radeon, or not even Radeon. It was Mobility Express something or another 200. It was. I was trying to play Fable the Lost Chapters on it. It didn't work so well. Really old integrated graphics that was still on the board. It had 100 gigabyte hard drive, 512 megs of RAM. So at the time it was okay, but it could have been better. But since I didn't know too much about AMD at the time, when I got into college, I started getting more and more into computer technology and stuff like that. I mean, I had a background in it. But then I bought a laptop that had an Athlon 2 processor, clocked at 2.2 gigahertz. It had AMD integrated graphics. And then I built this custom computer in 2012. I've had it since. This thing's amazing. It'll run almost every game I have. So.
Oh, first AMD product I actually had was one of the Athlon XP processors, and it was through buying multiple motherboards or whatever and switching them out or what have you. And this is where I discovered that my greatest weakness was installing a processor onto a motherboard. I found out the hard way why it's a good idea to have the heatsink on the CPU. The thing came off. I'm like, oh, it still works. And this game in Ubuntu is running really, really smoothly. All of a sudden, the system just shuts off. And then I figured out what happened. The chip fried. The chip was
Probably didn't
done.
have thermal paste that applied very well.
Yeah, the paste must have kind of went boom. And so the thing came off and everything else. So the heatsink was no longer on there, and I was an idiot and didn't know what I was doing. Ever since I've owned variations of like from Athlon 64s to a system with a mobile Sempron processor in it. One previous system I had, which somebody else has now, Phenom X2, which I no longer have. So now it's primarily, well, with the exception of this guy right here, if memory's no, this one's an Intel as well, with basically Radeon graphics in it, which
Oh,
I
is that
guess
the one that I gave you?
yeah. So that's the only thing with an AMD product in it at the moment. Everything else is Intel, or in this case with this desktop, NVIDIA for the graphics. One of these days I will own another AMD system, probably one that's power efficient with their APU at some point, but right now it's not in the cards.
Yeah, a couple of years ago when I built this PC that I'm using, I was debating on what did I want in a PC. I wanted to be able to play video games. I knew that for sure because I'm a gamer at heart. I always have been, ever since I was like 5 years old. I mean, I played outside and stuff because my parents would get fed up and say, "Go outside, go play, go do something. We're tired of you watching TV." But
Right.
I had Atari 2600. I mean, I've had all kinds of game systems and stuff like that. So I'm a gamer at heart, but I faced a real problem when I was trying to build this computer. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know much about like building a PC at all. So I did like research for about a year, and one of my original ideas was to get an AMD A8 APU, and at the time it was the 3870K, which was an unlocked part. I could overclock it and all kinds of other stuff. So when I did that, I decided to go with this instead. I believe we lost Thomas. Yeah, we did lose Thomas. His hard drive is going crazy. Um, huh. But I guess Thomas was having this issue with. He mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that we, the next report, we're going to interview Ken Starks, or at least that's one of the plans. We were supposed. Uh, we had planned to do that, and he was having problems with that this afternoon. But I think this issue is his desktop. He's got only 2 gigs of RAM in it, so if he fills that up, then Windows has this too. But on a Linux system, you have something called a swap partition, which basically, like, if your RAM fills up, what it does is it has a certain part of the hard drive set out to catch some like processes and stuff like that. Okay. Well, anyway, see you guys later.